The dinner table was silent, until Obari's mother slammed her hand against the glass and shouted, "This woman has been betraying our son." Every eye turned to me, Zoma, as whispers spread like wildfire. My chest tightened, but I didn't defend myself, because I knew something they didn't. My father-in-law was about to stand up, and when he spoke, every single face at that table would turn pale. Zoma walked into the house thinking it was just another family dinner. The table was set beautifully, and everyone was already seated. At first glance, it looked warm and welcoming, but the air around her felt heavy. She noticed the way her mother-in-law's eyes flickered toward her father-in-law, then quickly away. Her sister-in-law whispered something under her breath, and covered it with a fake smile. Every time Zoma tried to meet their eyes, they looked past her as if she wasn't even there. Obari, her husband, sat at the far end of the table. Normally, he would smile when she entered, pull out a chair for her, or ask how her day had gone. But this time he didn't even raise his head. His hand gripped the edge of the table, his eyes fixed on the plate in front of him. It was like he didn't want to see her. Zoma's heart sank, but she kept her face calm. She sat down, quietly watching everyone. The food was served and small talk filled the room, but under the laughter and chatter, Zoma could feel something sharp. The smiles looked painted on, the questions sounded forced. Every now and then, her mother-in-law leaned toward her sister-in-law, and they exchanged looks as though they were holding back a secret. Zoma picked up her spoon, but her appetite was gone. She was too busy studying the room. Why did Obari's uncle keep clearing his throat and avoiding her gaze? Why did her brother-in-law smirk whenever she shifted in her chair? Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Her husband still hadn't spoken to her. His silence was louder than anything else happening in that room. He didn't look angry, but he looked guilty. That was when Zoma's stomach tightened. She realized this dinner was not about family bonding. It was a setup. She remembered how her mother-in-law had insisted she attend, saying, "We are one family, and tonight we must all eat together." At the time, it sounded innocent, even kind. But now, sitting here, Zoma could feel the trap closing in. Every look, every whisper, every forced laugh confirmed it. She took a deep breath and straightened her back. If they thought she would be caught off guard, they were wrong. Something was coming, and she could feel the storm circling closer. And though her heart beat faster, her eyes stayed steady. Whatever game they were about to play, Zoma was ready. Halfway through the dinner, when everyone was eating in stiff silence, Zoma's mother-in-law suddenly pushed her chair back and stood up. The sound of her movement stopped all other conversations. Her eyes burned with anger as she looked straight at Zoma, and with a loud voice that carried across the table, she shouted, "This woman has been betraying my son." The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Forks dropped against plates, and chairs shifted as everyone turned to look at Zoma. Some relatives covered their mouths, others leaned closer, waiting to hear more. Zoma sat still, her spoon frozen halfway to her mouth. Inside, her heart thumped, but her face did not change. She simply looked at her mother-in-law, calm but alert. The room buzzed with whispers. Did she just say betrayal? One aunt muttered, "Is this true?" Another uncle whispered to his wife. Everyone wanted to hear the full story, and every eye was fixed on Zoma, like she was already guilty. Her mother-in-law slammed her hand against the table for attention and continued, "You all think she is innocent, but you don't know what I know. She has been disloyal to Obari. She pretends to be a good wife, but behind closed doors, she has been shaming this family." Obari sat frozen in his seat, his head down, refusing to meet Zoma's eyes. His silence felt like another accusation. It was as if he agreed with his mother's words by not speaking at all. That silence hurt Zoma more deeply than the angry voice rising across the table. Relatives shifted uncomfortably. Some shook their heads, already judging. Others leaned forward, hungry for scandal. Zoma's sister-in-law smirked in satisfaction, clearly enjoying the moment. It was obvious that this was not a sudden outburst. It was planned. Still, Zoma didn't defend herself. She sat upright, her eyes fixed on her mother-in-law. She could see the older woman's chest rising and falling with fake outrage. Her face flushed as if she had been waiting for this moment all evening. The room grew tense as the accusation echoed in the air. The atmosphere, already heavy, now felt poisonous. Every whisper carried doubt, every stare carried judgment. And yet, Zoma kept her dignity, refusing to argue or shout back. She knew something no one else did, that the truth was on her side, and the louder her mother-in-law became, the more desperate she looked. In that moment, the family dinner turned into a public trial, and Zoma was placed in the center of it. She could feel the storm breaking over her, but deep inside, she also knew the storm would not end the way her enemies expected. The room was still ringing with the heavy words of her mother-in-law when Zoma slowly turned her eyes toward her husband. In that moment, all she wanted was for Obari to stand up for her, to tell everyone that the accusations were lies. She expected him to at least meet her gaze, to show that he trusted the woman he had vowed to love and protect. But instead, Obari kept his head bowed low, his eyes fixed on the table, his lips pressed together tightly, and his hands trembled slightly on his lap. The silence stretched across the table like a shadow. Every relative noticed it. Every cousin, uncle, and aunt saw the way Obari avoided Zoma's eyes. To them, his silence was proof. If a husband could not defend his own wife, then maybe the rumors were true. Whispers started again, low but sharp, slicing through the tense atmosphere. Why isn't he saying anything? One muttered. If she is innocent, wouldn't he defend her? Another whispered. Zoma's chest ached as she watched her husband shrink under his mother's presence. She had endured many things in her marriage, but nothing stung like this. His silence in the face of public shame. Her heart felt like it was breaking into pieces, yet on the outside, she refused to show it. She sat tall, her back straight, her face calm, her eyes clear. She would not let them see her crumble. Obari's silence did more damage than the cruel accusations. His bowed head made it seem as though he agreed with them. Each second he stayed quiet added fuel to the fire his mother had started. Relatives who were unsure began to lean toward belief. Some even shook their heads at Zoma, their pity mixing with judgment. It was as if the entire room was already writing her guilty without hearing the truth. But deep inside, Zoma clung to her strength. She knew something the others did not. She knew that silence could be powerful, but not in the way they thought. Her husband's quietness was a weakness, a failure to protect her. But the truth that was waiting to come would not need his voice. The truth was bigger than his silence. So while Obari lowered his head in shame, Zoma lifted hers. She let her eyes sweep across the room, meeting each doubtful stare with calm defiance. Her heart was heavy, but her spirit did not bend. She knew the truth was close to breaking through. And when it did, every whisper, every judgment, and even her husband's silence would turn back on those who tried to destroy her. Just when the silence around Obari became too heavy, his sister leaned forward with a sly smile and placed a brown envelope on the table. Since everyone is wondering, she said, we brought proof. The room stirred as all eyes moved to the envelope. Zoma sat still, her hands folded neatly on her lap, refusing to flinch. She already knew whatever was inside was not the truth, but carefully crafted lies. Her mother-in-law picked up the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs. She held them up one by one, flashing them for everyone at the table to see. In the pictures, Zoma was standing with a man in different places, outside a cafe, near a market, at the corner of a street. The whispers grew louder, and the gasps came sharper. Look at her, someone said under their breath. She has been meeting another man. Zoma's sister-in-law jumped in eagerly, her voice dripping with fake sadness. We tried to keep this quiet. We did not want to embarrass Obari. But how long can we allow her to disgrace our family? These pictures don't lie. She looked at Zoma as if she had already won. Another cousin pulled out his phone and opened a message thread, reading aloud the rumors that had been spreading around town. People say they've seen her sneaking around, he declared. She has been spotted more than once with this same man. The room buzzed with judgment. Faces turned cold. Stares pressed hard against Zoma. But behind those staged photos and whispered lies, Zoma could see the fingerprints of a plan. Every word spoken, every picture shown, was part of a scheme they had prepared long before this dinner. They wanted to corner her, to strip her of dignity in front of the entire family, and force her to break. Her mother-in-law slammed the photos on the table and leaned forward, her voice sharp. This is who she really is. You call her your daughter-in-law, but she has been nothing but a shame to our son and to this family. She looked around triumphantly, certain that everyone would side with her. Some relatives shook their heads in disappointment. Others muttered about betrayal. They believed the staged evidence. To them, the case was closed. The in-laws smiled to themselves, convinced they had finally destroyed Zoma's place in the family. But Zoma sat motionless, her face calm. They thought she was cornered, but in truth, they had only revealed their own desperation. They didn't know that their lies were about to be shattered, and the same proof they proudly displayed would soon expose them instead. The table was no longer filled with the warmth of dinner. Instead, it had turned into a court, and Zoma was seated as the accused. As the photographs and rumors spread around, the family began to split into sides. An aunt shook her head slowly, her lips pressed together in disappointment. She whispered to the person beside her, "I always knew something was wrong with her." A cousin leaned forward and muttered, "Poor Obari. Imagine what he has been going through." The words stung Zoma, not because they were true, but because they were spoken with such certainty, as though the lies had already been proven. Her sister-in-law smirked and folded her arms, as if she had been waiting for this very moment of downfall. Some relatives nodded in agreement with the accusers, eager to distance themselves from Zoma. Others avoided her eyes completely, as if looking at her would taint their own reputation. The judgment was heavy, and Zoma could feel it pressing down on her chest, but she sat tall, refusing to let her composure break. What hurt the most was not just the whispers, but the pitying looks. A few family members shook their heads sadly, as if they believed she had truly betrayed her husband. "Such a shame," one uncle sighed. "We thought she was different." Every comment, every murmur, was another weight added to her heart. And then there was Obari, still silent. His head remained low, his eyes fixed on the table. The table was no longer filled with the warmth of dinner. Instead, it had turned into a court, and Zoma was seated as the accused. As the photographs and rumors spread around, the family began to split into sides. An aunt shook her head slowly, her lips pressed together in disappointment. She whispered to the person beside her, "I always knew something was wrong with her." A cousin leaned forward and muttered, "Poor Obari. Imagine what he has been going through." The words stung Zoma, not because they were true, but because they were spoken with such certainty, as though the lies had already been proven. Her sister-in-law smirked and folded her arms, as if she had been waiting for this very moment of downfall. Some relatives nodded in agreement with the accusers, eager to distance themselves from Zoma. Others avoided her eyes completely, as if looking at her would taint their own reputation. The judgment was heavy, and Zoma could feel it pressing down on her chest, but she sat tall, refusing to let her composure break. What hurt the most was not just the whispers, but the pitying looks. A few family members shook their heads sadly, as if they believed she had truly betrayed her husband. "Such a shame," one uncle sighed. "We thought she was different." Every comment, every murmur, was another weight added to her heart. And then there was Obari, still silent. His head remained low, his eyes fixed on the table, as though the wood grains were more important than the storm tearing his marriage apart. His silence confirmed in many eyes what they already wanted to believe, that Zoma was guilty. But while most of the table was busy casting judgment, one person had not spoken a word. Elder Tay, Obari's father, sat quietly at the far end. His expression was unreadable, his eyes sharp and watchful. Unlike the others, he did not shake his head or mutter under his breath. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting calmly in his lap, observing everyone at the table as if he were studying each reaction carefully. Zoma noticed him. Amid the storm of accusations, her eyes caught his, and though he said nothing, there was something steady about his gaze. It was not filled with pity or judgment. It was the gaze of someone who was waiting, someone who already knew more than what was being said. The family continued to divide. Half leaned toward the in-laws' claims, whispering about betrayal and disgrace. The other half stayed unsure, uncomfortable but silent, afraid to challenge the loudest voices in the room. And at the center of it all, Elder Tay remained like a stone, silent, firm, unmoving. Zoma felt the weight of the family's judgment, but she also felt that somewhere in that silence, there was hope. Elder Tay's sharp eyes told her that he was not just watching the scene unfold, he was waiting for the right moment to strike, and when he did, the truth would shake the table more than any accusation ever could. The room was heavy with whispers and sharp stares. The photographs lay scattered on the table. The rumors had already been spoken, and Obari's silence still cut through Zoma's heart like a blade. Everyone seemed to be waiting for her to cry, to beg, to scream, or at least try to explain herself. But Zoma did none of those things. She sat still, her posture straight, her eyes steady. Her face showed no fear, no anger, no desperation. Her mother-in-law leaned forward with triumph, certain she had broken her. "Say something, Zoma. Do you deny it?" she demanded, her voice filled with fire. The others joined in with murmurs. "She has no defense," one cousin said. "Her silence proves her guilt," another whispered. It was exactly what the schemers wanted, to corner her until she fell apart. But Zoma slowly inhaled, steadying her breath. Her heart was beating hard inside her chest. Yet on the outside, she looked composed, almost regal. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, low, and controlled. Every word was clear. She looked around the table, her eyes touching each face before she said, "If this is the truth, let it stand. But if it is a lie, then let the truth burn those who built it." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water. The effect was immediate. The relatives who had been whispering fell silent. Even her enemies blinked in surprise, as if they did not expect her to respond with such calm strength. They had been waiting for her to scream or cry, but instead, she placed the weight of judgment back onto them. Her mother-in-law's face tightened, her lips pressing together in anger. She wanted Zoma to appear weak, but now Zoma's calmness made her look desperate. The sister-in-law shifted uncomfortably in her chair, no longer as confident as before. The photographs, once their strongest weapon, suddenly looked less powerful against Zoma's composed spirit. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Everyone at the table felt it. A few relatives who had judged her so quickly began to glance at one another, uneasy. They wondered if perhaps they had been too fast to believe the lies. Her simple words carried more weight than a long defense could have, because they pointed back at the accusers. If what they said was false, then they were the ones standing on dangerous ground. Zoma did not speak again. She folded her hands neatly on her lap and allowed the silence to stretch. Her eyes did not waver, her chin remained lifted. She looked like a woman who had nothing to hide, and that unsettled everyone even more. In that moment, without shouting or pleading, Zoma shifted the atmosphere. The accusations no longer felt solid. The family began to feel a crack in the story they had been told. And though no one admitted it out loud, a quiet fear began to grow, not for Zoma, but for the people who had tried so hard to destroy her. The table sat in heavy silence after Zoma's calm words. No one dared to speak, though the tension was so thick it could almost be touched. Her mother-in-law's eyes burned with anger, her sister-in-law shifted in her chair nervously, and Obari still refused to lift his head. Everyone was waiting for someone else to break the silence. And then slowly Elder Tay, the father of the house, rose to his feet. All eyes turned to him at once. He was a man of few words, known for his wisdom and authority. When he spoke, the family always listened. His tall figure stood steady, his face stern, and his eyes sharper than ever. He cleared his throat and said, "Enough." The single word cut through the whispers and froze the room. Elder Tay let his gaze sweep across the table before resting on his wife and daughter-in-law. "I have listened to every word tonight," he said, his voice firm. "And I have stayed silent long enough to hear the truth behind the noise. What you do not know, and what they did not want you to know, is that this was never about Zoma. This was about greed." Gasps filled the air as he leaned forward, his tone growing heavier. "For months they have been plotting, yes, plotting. They wanted to ruin Zoma's name, so that Obari would turn against her. They believed that if she was out of the picture, they could gain control over his wealth, his inheritance, and every decision he makes. Do not look surprised. I have seen it with my own eyes." His wife stiffened, trying to interrupt, but his hand went up, silencing her. "Do not deny it. I found the meetings, the messages, and the payments made to those who spread these rumors. I saw the forged photographs before you ever brought them here tonight. You thought I would not notice, but you forget I am not blind to what happens in my own family." The room fell into stunned silence. Relatives exchanged shocked looks, unsure of what to believe. Elder Tay's voice grew even stronger. "You all wanted proof. And proof is what I have. This was never Zoma's shame. It is your shame." He turned toward his wife and daughter-in-law, his eyes piercing. "How dare you bring lies into this house? How dare you try to destroy a woman's life to satisfy your hunger for control?" The faces of the accusers paled, their confidence crumbling. The whispers around the table turned into murmurs of disbelief. For the first time that night, Zoma felt the weight shift. She was no longer the one on trial. The spotlight had moved, and it now burned brightly on the very people who tried to ruin her. Elder Tay stood tall, his words echoing in every heart. The truth was out, and nothing could silence it anymore. Gasps filled the room as Elder Tay slowly placed a thick brown envelope on the dining table. Every eye followed his hand, waiting to see what was inside. With calm authority, he opened it and pulled out sheets of paper, photographs, and even a small recorder. He did not rush. He wanted everyone to see clearly. Then, in a voice that carried both weight and truth, he began to explain. For months he had suspected foul play, and instead of speaking too soon, he had quietly gathered proof. Now he was ready to uncover everything. The first paper he held up was a signed receipt, money that had been paid to strangers hired to spread lies about Zoma in the marketplace. He explained how the in-laws had gone as far as paying people to whisper rumors into the ears of relatives and neighbors, making it seem like Zoma was unfaithful. Murmurs spread through the table as the reality sank in. Some of the very people who claimed to be protecting family honor were the ones dragging it through the mud. Next, Elder Tay played a recording. The voices were clear. It was two of the in-laws, speaking in hushed tones but admitting to forging photos and planning how to present them as proof against Zoma. The recording left no room for doubt. The same mouths that had just accused her of betrayal were now caught plotting her downfall. The family sat frozen, their food untouched, their hands stiff with shock. He laid out photographs. One showed the in-laws meeting strangers at night. Another showed the fake evidence being edited and arranged. Elder Tay explained how he had followed them secretly, even pretending to be unaware, just so he could bring the truth to light at the right time. Each paper he revealed was like a hammer breaking the wall of lies. Zoma sat quietly, her eyes wet but strong. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. The truth was speaking louder than any words she could have said. Her enemies shifted in their seats, their confidence melting away. The bold ones who had raised their voices against her now stared at the table, ashamed. Finally, Elder Tay placed the last document down. It was a letter from one of their hired accomplices, confessing everything after feeling guilty. The letter described in detail how they were paid to ruin Zoma's name, and it matched perfectly with all the other evidence. At that moment, the entire room fell into heavy silence. No one could deny what they had just seen and heard. The same relatives who had judged Zoma only moments ago were now looking at her with guilt, some even in regret. The lies had been ripped apart, and the truth stood bare, undeniable, and powerful. The table that once echoed with accusations was now frozen in disbelief, shaken by the weight of Elder Tay's revelations. Relatives who had been quick to nod and whisper against Zoma now sat frozen, their faces heavy with shame. The very same cousins and uncles who pointed fingers began to exchange nervous looks. Their earlier confidence drained away as the evidence lay exposed before them. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet Zoma's calm gaze, while others began to murmur quietly, admitting to themselves that they had been wrong. The room shifted slowly, like a tide turning, and all the judgment that once pressed heavily on Zoma began to flow toward the true culprits. Obari sat stiff in his chair, his hands trembling against his knees. His chest rose and fell quickly, and his mind replayed every moment he had doubted his wife, every time he had turned away instead of standing by her. Now in the open light of truth, he saw the scars his silence had caused. He realized he had failed Zoma not once but many times, giving room for lies to fester instead of protecting her. His eyes welled with regret, and his throat tightened, but no words could undo the damage. He had chosen to believe the wrong voices, and now the weight of that choice crushed him. Across the table, the in-laws who had led the scheme sat pale and stiff. Their lips trembled, but no excuses came out. The lies they had crafted so carefully were broken in an instant, and the family they had hoped to manipulate now stared at them with anger and disgust. Their earlier pride vanished, leaving only fear in its place. The smug smiles they once wore were gone, replaced by the dread of exposure. They knew their names would never again carry honor in this family, that their betrayal would be remembered. The silence in the room grew heavier, but it no longer pressed on Zoma. Instead, it pressed on those who had woven the trap. Some relatives began to speak out, voices sharp with blame. "How could you do this to her?" one aunt asked angrily. "We trusted your words," another uncle added, shaking his head in disbelief. Slowly, Every eye that once judged Zoma turned against the schemers, leaving them isolated, cornered, and defenseless. Zoma sat still, her calm presence stronger than any raised voice. She did not need to argue or remind anyone of her innocence. The truth itself had fought for her. Her silence now carried more weight than their many words, and her dignity shone brighter than their schemes. She remained composed, while those who had sought her downfall squirmed under the family's piercing stares. Obari, his voice weak, finally turned to his wife. He wanted to reach for her hand, but shame kept him frozen. His heart knew he had almost lost her forever, not to another man or to fate, but to his own blindness. The turning of the tables left him with a bitter truth. His loyalty had faltered, and now it was his turn to beg for forgiveness. The family dinner that had started as a trap ended as a stage of judgment, but not for Zoma. Instead, the very people who had tried to destroy her now faced the weight of their own betrayal, and they could no longer escape the truth. Zoma stood tall, her eyes calm and steady as the room fell into silence. Everyone waited for her to react, to maybe shout or cry, but she did neither. She simply straightened her shoulders and let a soft breath escape. Her words were not many, but they carried the weight of wisdom and strength. "I needed no defense," she said gently, her voice flowing like a quiet river. The truth speaks for itself. The simplicity of her statement struck everyone harder than any long speech could have. There was no bitterness in her tone, no anger, no need to prove herself. She had allowed the truth to fight for her, and it had. Her in-laws, who once smirked and whispered, could not even raise their eyes to meet hers. Their plan, carefully built with lies and deceit, had crumbled before their very faces. They thought they would win, that they could paint Zoma black and watch her drown in shame. But now, sitting there in the wreckage of their own scheme, they realized they had lost far more than they ever imagined. They had lost their honor, their respect, and the trust of the family. Obari, her husband, sat frozen, his face pale as he looked at his wife. Shame filled his eyes as he remembered how quickly he had doubted her, how easily he had allowed others to poison his mind against the woman who stood by him through everything. His heart ached with regret, knowing he almost destroyed the best part of his life because he listened to the wrong voices. Zoma did not look at him with spite or with begging eyes. She did not ask for his apology, nor did she demand anything from him. She simply carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who knew her worth. Every step she took toward the door was measured, graceful, and unhurried. Each step echoed louder in the hearts of those watching than any curse or insult could have. When she reached the doorway, she paused for just a moment. Without turning back, she left behind one final message, not in words but in her presence. She showed them that a woman wronged does not always need to fight with fire. Sometimes her silence and her grace can become the sharpest weapon of all. The room remained still after she left, as if the air itself was heavy with her strength. The in-laws shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces drained of pride. They could not boast anymore, they could not hide, and they could not undo what had been revealed. They had plotted against her, but in the end, they had destroyed themselves. Zoma walked out not just as a wife who survived betrayal, but as a woman who rose above it. Her dignity was untouched, her spirit unbroken, and her silence louder than any storm. And in that silence everyone knew, Zoma had truly won.